Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. I'm James, continuing on with my build of the Aeromite RC plane. I'm building this plane off of a set of plans, and I mentioned it in all the introductions to my videos in this build series that you can't get this plane in the kit, but if you're interested in building it off a set of plans like I have back here, check out my introduction video for this build series, and I tell you a few different ways on how to do that. So in this video, going to be moving on, and actually we're getting very close to finishing up the model, and I think in terms of the construction, and I think I'm going to be able to do the covering pretty soon, but we have a few more things to do before we get there. One of them is I need to attach this little hatch I made, which is going to be the access hatch for the fuel tank, which is going to go right in here, and I'm going to attach that with a dowel and also with probably a small little screw or something back in this area right here. And then the other thing I'm going to do, and I was going to do this in the last video, but if you check out that video, I mentioned that kind of was getting a little bit long, so I decided to go ahead and do it in this video, which is to complete the underside of the wing here by constructing or making a fairing that's going to basically just fill in these spaces here between the fuselage and the wing, just to make it sort of a smoother finish, more finished look. As it is right now, the plane would be fine like this. It would fly fine, it'd be okay, but obviously it looks a little unfinished there. So what we're looking at here is the cross section of the wing and the fuselage, again pointing out the two fairings. There's one in the front here and one in the back here. And the way I'm going to do this is thought about, a good way to do it is to use the templates that I have for that I used to make my ribs. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out, basically I'm going to cut out a piece like here and cut out a piece right here, for example, and hopefully I can get them to sort of match as it's shown here. So I'll cut out this piece here, it'll be this one, and obviously this one right here will be right here. And then here's my plan. Let me show you how I'm going to use those. Let's go back to the plane now. So back to the plane here. So again, here's the piece that I'm going to use as my example. I'm going to cut like this piece out and that one. And then what I can do is I can just flip them over and insert them here and kind of just fill in almost like a fence that will go across here and also one back here. And then I'm going to box it in. I'm going to put a little piece up here and probably a little piece back here. And then let me show you how I'm going to fill it in. So this is what I'm going to use to fill in that space that I mentioned I'm going to make with the balsa wood pieces. These are micro balloons. Now this brand is Top Flight. Top Flight is no longer in business, but it doesn't matter because all kinds of manufacturers make micro balloons, and they may go by different names and such, but essentially what they are, again, I'm not an expert on micro balloons. I've used them a few times and I like them when I use them. What they are is they're basically microscopic glass beads. And I think they make them out of different materials. You got to be careful when you work with them because it's pretty much like a powder. It is a powder. You can kind of see it in there. And you want to wear a dust mask and that type of thing. You don't want to inhale this stuff. But what you do, what it's used for, is it says here it's a filler, and you mix it with either epoxy resin, like an epoxy resin, and just a straight epoxy if you want. And you can mix it in different consistencies. And the higher the ratio of the micro balloons to the epoxy material, the thicker it will become. So if you like it to be a little bit thinner and you need to kind of get it into small crevices and things, you probably would not put as many micro balloons in. If you want it to be very thick and almost like a putty, you put more micro balloons in. Pretty much common sense, not a big deal. So this is what I plan to do. I'm going to go ahead and get that area built up like I mentioned. Then I'm going to come back and we'll mix some micro balloons. We'll fill in the open space there. And the nice thing about it is it's relatively light, it's very strong, and you can also sand it. So once I get the micro balloons in, we'll let it cure. Then I can come back and sand it nicely and finish off the bottom of the plane. So it's kind of a fun thing to do. And again, I haven't done it a lot, but I've done it once in a while, and every time I do it, it turns out pretty good. So I'm looking forward to doing this. I think it's a good option for this particular build. And then real quick, I'll go back to my template here. So one thing we got to remember is that the template for the rib is actually a little bit smaller than the finished wing because it doesn't have the sheeting on it. So this is a good starting point. I'll cut my pieces and then I'm just going to basically trim them to fit. All right, well that came out a lot better than I thought it was going to. That was actually pretty darn easy. So as you can see, I have this one side sort of set up, and it's cut, you know, a little bit large. But that's fine because, like I said, I'm going to fill it in and I'll just shape it later, but this is a good starting point. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make another set of these for this side. Okay, so I think this came out okay. So the thing you may have noticed that I was gluing these pieces on, I was being very careful. I just put little beads of glue for these little pieces here. I didn't want to accidentally glue this to the fuselage. That would have been pretty bad. So the next step is going to be to go ahead and fill this in with our micro balloons. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and just cover this little hole right here. I don't want to mess up that hole. And also I want to cover up the hole where the dowel is here. Probably pull the dowel out. Hopefully I didn't glue it in there. There we go. So you can see a little hole in there. I don't want to get that plugged up. So I'll cover that and this, and then we'll come back and we'll put our micro balloons on here. And then once that cures, we can go back, put it back on the fuselage and do our final sanding. And then one thing else I want to point out is, like everything I do, it's not perfect. So I do have some gaps here and there. I don't have a perfect fit, like on this edge, like right this little seam back in here. And there's a couple little gaps here and there. So I want to fill those in. I'm just going to go ahead and use the old baking soda method with a CA. Okay, so now it's time to mix our micro balloons. So for this, I'm just going to be using that Bob Smith Industries 30-minute epoxy. Now a lot of times you can use, or maybe sometimes it's preferable to use, just an epoxy resin. And you know, the resin is not as hard and it will be a little bit easier to sand and shape. So this epoxy will be the opposite. It may be a little bit tougher to sand, but I don't have any resin with me. And this is a pretty small application, so I don't want to go buy a couple of big bottles of resin right now. So I'm just going to go ahead and try it with this regular slow cure epoxy. Should come out fine. First things first, I want to cover that hole like I mentioned so that I don't get any of the micro balloons to plug that up on me. So I'll just cover that, no big deal. Then I also need to cover the little opening for the dowel, as I mentioned. I don't want to get that blocked. So I'll just put some tape on that. And as I mentioned earlier, certainly don't want to inhale any of this stuff. So for safety, I'm just going to be using this N95 respirator, and that'll help prevent those particles from being inhaled. Okay, well I'm going to start by actually putting in my epoxy first, and then I'll add the micro balloons to the epoxy. Now one thing that I always experience when I do this is that I tend to mix too much, and I also tend to get too much epoxy to start with, and that's kind of why I end up making too much, because really it goes a long way. So I would suggest starting out with a small amount of epoxy, adding your micro balloons to the consistency that you want, and if you need more, add a little bit more epoxy to that. So that's just the way I'm going to try to do it. And I'm going to put on my dust mask here and we'll get started. Well, there you have it. So, was that a good idea or not? I think it's going to work fine for what I intended it to do here, which is basically sort of fill in this odd shape. But was it, easier than, maybe doing it with balsa and kind of building it up and carving it or something like that? I don't know. You tell me. It was kind of fun to do this, but at the same time, it is a little tricky, and you do have to be careful. One thing I'll mention real quick also is that because I didn't mix it super thick, it had a nice sort of self-leveling quality to it. So as I was sort of sticking it in here, kind of trying to dab it in there, after a few minutes or so, it would just level out. So all I did was just kind of keep adding to it, and I just very carefully tried to kind of get it level, but it really kind of found its own leveling sort of point. So that was pretty cool. Okay, let's let this thing cure and we'll come back and take a look. Okay, while our wing fairing is curing, I'm going to move on to the next item in this video, which is attaching the hatch for the fuel tank compartment. So in an earlier video, sort of way back in the beginning of the build, forget which number it is, I made this little compartment hatch here out of balsa pieces. And my plan is to attach it using a dowel in the front. I'm going to drill a hole in this bulkhead, and this is an 1/8 inch diameter dowel. And I'm going to insert that here, and therefore the hatch will sort of plug in to that bulkhead like so. And then in the back here, I'm going to attach a small piece of, like a small block of balsa, and I'm going to set in that balsa a little 440 nut, which I have here, and then I have a 440 screw here. And so I'm going to drill a hole through this, and then this is going to be inserted through the top of the hatch here, and then I'm just going to screw it into the little nut that I have attached to this little piece of wood. And then I'm going to kind of make it easier to take on and off out in the field, and also to sort of secure it a little bit, I'm going to cut a little piece of fuel tubing here, like a little ring of it, and I'll insert that all the way up to the top here, to the head of the screw here. And then that helps you kind of hold on to it, and also be able to, when you screw it down, it sort of like pushes into it, so it helps kind of keep it secure. Okay, so that's the plan. So one other thing I wanted to point out here real quick is when I made this, you'll notice that I put this one piece a little forward. This one's obviously toward the front here, and I didn't put this one all the way back, because if I did, I thought that maybe it would get in the way. It would sort of hit this piece right here when I slid on the hatch. So my thoughts are, is as I slide the hatch on, I can really get down, I can really put it down really close like that. And this way I can get a pretty snug fit, because I can just get it down in here and get that dowel to engage right there and just sort of snap it in like this. If I didn't have that if that piece was all the way back here, for example, it would probably hit this fuselage right here. Plus it wouldn't work very well with the block of wood also. So that's why I have it all the way back here. So if you're going to make a hatch, maybe consider that type of thing when you're doing it. So let's start with the dowel connection. And one thing I realized, this is probably a little bit too thin. I want something a little more thick for the dowel to set into. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut a piece of this, and I'm just going to stick a little block here, and then I'll just drill through that. And of course the dowel will have something a little bit more to bite into. Okay, well, this hatch came out okay. I think this is going to be a nice little system here, easy to use, and should work just fine. Okay, so now I'm going to move back onto our wing and check out our micro balloons and do that finishing sanding on that. Okay, well, here is our finished micro balloons. They're all cured now and it's either hard, very shiny. You know, like I said, you know, earlier, you know, it really leveled out nicely, and now I just have to sand this down. You know, here's sort of the dried up cup I was using. It's kind of cool. Looks like something from Aliens or something. Anyhow, so now what I can do is, it looks like kind of looks like a piece of plastic in here, but actually it's sandable, and I don't know how much I'll be able to show. And what I don't want to do is, I'm going to do this outside, so I'm just going to show a little bit here, but I'm going to take it off camera and just sand this off here, just to get it to be, just to level it out and get rid of sort of the gunk around the edges and such. And yeah, I want to take it outside, and again, I want to wear my mask so that I don't inhale any of these particles. So, and then as I've done before, when I'm sanding one area and I want to avoid the other area, I'm going to go ahead and mask off around it. That'll help protect it. All right, so as you saw, I drilled out that hole for the wing mounting bolt, and then I just put the wing on here, and you can see here that I'm a little bit high. If you look closely right here, I'm a little bit high on both sides. It's a little bit tall, I guess I should say. So what I need to do is I just need to continue to kind of sand this down to get it to match these two areas on the fuselage, and then I'll be finished. Okay, well, I finished up the sanding here. I took it outside and did it out there. It took some time to get it straight and level with the fuselage here. Looks like I have a little bit of work left maybe to do off camera again, but I think it's pretty close as is. And you'll notice this little spot I have right here. You know, I poked a hole again in the sheeting here. This is very thin sheeting, and I've been having such a challenge with it. Every time I pick it up, I forget how thin it is, and I've been kind of popping it once in a while. So in any case, I did that. So the fairing is now finished, and I think it looks okay. And then of course we flip it over, and then we have our fuel hatch is finished as well. So yeah, I'm really happy how those two things came out. Now one thing I want to do is go back to this fairing and take a look at it and think about different ways that we could do this. You know, obviously I did it with the micro balloons. It's a little messy, but it turns out okay. One thing I would recommend is, yeah, use a resin. It is still a little bit, even though it is sandable with an epoxy resin or a resin mix is actually better. It's a lot easier to sand and shape after you use it that way. So I would just recommend, just flat out, if you're going to be using micro balloons, use a resin instead of just a straight epoxy. The other thing is, there's other ways to do this besides filling it in like I did here. I could have built up the sides like I did and just maybe put a plank of wood over it. That would have been pretty simple. And maybe I could have even used solid pieces and just sanded it and shaped it that way. So there's a variety of ways of doing that. So, you know, give me your comments. Tell me what you think and such, and tell me what you think about the micro balloons. Now, one thing I did want to mention about the micro balloons is that, yeah, maybe for a little plane like this, it was overkill. But eventually, if you start building scale models and such, you'll start using this stuff more to get sort of unique shapes and such, especially when you're building a scale model, because you have, you know, it's not just a simple sort of block or straight kind of frames like these like box structures you have with a lot of the trainers and such. When you get into building, you know, a scale plane, you have a lot of compound curves and such, and that in that situation you need to be using something like a micro balloons and fillers and such to get all those shapes right. So just look at it as maybe like sort of a little bit of practicing for that type of a build. Okay, so that's going to be about it for this video. And then the next step in the build is actually going to be kind of a simple one, probably a short video. I just need to make my ailerons, and then I need to finish up the elevator and the rudder. And those are a couple of easy steps. And then after that, probably the following video, going to get into covering it. And then once I get it covered, then we'll move on to actually installing the components and hooking up everything and getting close to finishing this plane up. So I'm really excited about that. So in any case, until then, thanks for tagging along with the build. I really appreciate it, and we will see you next time.